It is estimated that China suffered 19.5 million deaths during the Second World War, a figure that accounts for a total of 35 million Chinese who died during over a decade of Japanese occupation. A brutal event directly related to the global conflict. While the conflict that took place between 1939 and 1945 involved the entire planet, little is said about the participation of one of the nations most affected by this event. That's why in today's video, we're going to review in detail China's role in the Second World War. We'll also analyze its relationship with the Allies, its violent and cruel enmity with Japan, and consider how internal political disputes affected Chinese combat during the course of the war. Welcome to a new video of military history. Don't miss this fascinating installment. Most people believe that the Second World War began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. This is true if we consider only European territory as the battleground. However, 2 years earlier, the Japanese Empire invaded China, initiating the Axis advance into communist territories, or, alternatively, those more associated with what would later become the Allies. This means that the Asian theater of the Second World War was already underway when Hitler began his war in Europe. It's important not to forget that China played a key role, often overlooked by the West. Let's begin by providing some context to understand what happened in the Giant of the East. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912 led to unbearable instability in China. And in 1927, a civil war erupted between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. This internal turmoil resulted in China becoming very weakened and fragile, making it an easy and attractive target for the Japanese Empire. Japan had a clear plan for the region. It wanted to become the hegemonic leader of Asia through the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a self-sufficient bloc of countries with Japan as its major reference. One of the first places the empire wanted to annex was Manchuria, a resource-rich and sparsely populated region in northern China. After a period of military and diplomatic pressure, weakened China allowed Japan to control the Manchurian railways in the late 1920s. Tensions continued to rise until, in September 1931, one of the region's railways was the target of an attack. The official version labeled it as a Chinese attack, but in reality, Japan was responsible, having carried it out to justify further military operations in the region. Subsequently, shortly after the bombing, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria and established a regime manipulated by the empire. From there, they began to advance southward, occupying more and more Chinese territory. However, it wasn't until a particular event that the large-scale invasion would be unleashed. The incident that marked the beginning of the systematic Japanese occupation was a bloody confrontation between Chinese and Japanese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge, an important access point to China. This confrontation was initially provoked by reports of a missing Japanese soldier in the area. The event occurred on July 7, 1937, when imperial troops near the Chinese capital of Beijing attempted to enter a village to search for the missing soldier. When local guards denied them access, a firefight broke out, leading to a small war, serving as an excuse for the Japanese's large-scale invasion of the rest of the country. Since the recruit later appeared without any trouble, there is suspicion about the accuracy of that report, just as there was suspicion regarding the Manchurian railway attack. From that moment, the imperial expansion into Chinese territory began to grow rapidly. The Japanese plan was to conquer the most important routes and cities. While Beijing was the legal capital, the government of Chiang Kai-shek had moved most official affairs to Nanjing, making the city the target of imperial troops. Despite concentrating the leaders and resources of the nationalists, the fact that Chinese forces were poorly trained allowed Japanese troops to quickly capture Nanjing. Kai-shek ordered an evacuation of the city and managed to establish another capital in Chongqing, but most of the besieged city's inhabitants were not so lucky. The fierce Japanese attack resulted in the Japanese army massacring, torturing, and raping the local population in a hellish episode that lasted from December 1937 to January 1938. This tragic event of the Second World War is known as the Rape of Nanking, in which it is estimated that approximately 300,000 innocent civilians died. This brutality was considered a major strategic mistake, as it generated strong resentment among the Chinese people, deterring potential collaborators. Most of eastern China was under Japanese control, including the cities of Shanghai, Nanjing, and Wuhan. Many external observers assumed that China would not be able to resist, so the most likely scenario was a Japanese victory. However, the Chinese leader, nationalist Chiang Kai-shek, formed an unexpected alliance with his eternal rivals, the Communists led by Mao. This new front refused to surrender and retreated inland to continue the resistance. A sense of nationalism blurred the differences between the two sides, rallying them against a formidable and bloody common enemy.
My father didn't run away and chose to stay at home guarding the house. The Japanese invaders broke in and stole everything. They dragged my father outside and forced him to carry the items. When he finished, they killed him immediately.
By the end of 1938, the Empire of Japan already controlled China's major industrial centers, and to exacerbate the situation, it had captured several ports on the coast to hinder trade and reduce their enemies' resources. The idea was for Chinese resistance to weaken, reducing the intensity of the conflict. The secondary objective was to withdraw some of the troops to send them back to Japan, thereby reducing the high costs of occupation. Beyond the plan, the Japanese continued the invasion of Chinese territory for as long as they could, reaching bestial levels of violence. It was known that they set up scientific research bases where they experimented with diseases and plagues using live prisoners. In cities under imperial control, different scientific settlements committed atrocities, such as operating on live people without anesthesia and testing biological weapons on inmates. The horrendous results were intended for war, such as the flea bomb, which spreads bubonic plague, or the defoliant bomb, which destroys enemy crops. These weapons were used against China, ending with hundreds of thousands of lives. The responsible individual, Shiro Ishii, at the end of the war, ordered the destruction and burial of all evidence from the complexes, much like the Nazis did with the extermination camps.
非常害怕，当时这个日本兵这个帽子飘飘的，戴了一个帽子，但是这个没想到，这个刀头子是亮的，还有一个白旗子，还有一个戴红爸爸，都是在那是个我父亲一看到是个非常害怕，一害怕就想他后跑，都来不及跑，就跟日本人就大家击上打，不是一个人打，一下子就打死他。
Chiang Kai-shek had to move inland when the Japanese invaded the major cities of the east, while the Chinese communists resisted in their base in the northwest of the country. To many citizens, it seemed that China had to surrender and accept peace, yielding territory and power. However, the country continued to resist, initially with some modest unofficial help from the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. It's important to note that if China had surrendered in 1938, Japan would have controlled the entire territory for several years. Japanese forces could have found themselves in a position to confront the USSR, dominate all of Southeast Asia, or even attack British India. Despite its significance, the war between China and Japan began as a conflict in which no Western power was openly involved, at least until the fateful events in Hawaii in 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Just before 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, a Japanese military plane attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base located in Hawaii. After 2 hours of siege, the attack resulted in the destruction of 18 U.S. warships and 347 combat aircraft, but the worst part was that the Japanese offensive killed 2,403 people and injured another 1,178. President Roosevelt, when announcing the news to a shocked nation, described it as a day that will live in infamy. When Japan decided to declare war on the Americans, they knew they were taking an immeasurable risk. However, the empire's military leaders were betting on quickly winning the conflict, paralyzing the U.S. Navy's capabilities in the Pacific, thus preventing them from interfering with Japan's expansion in Southeast Asia. The Japanese needed to secure an immediate victory because they knew, just like British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, that the United States' industrial capacity to renew its supply of ships and weapons, as well as its troop recruitment, could be decisive in winning the war. The United States quickly allied with China, providing them with much-needed relief by diverting the Japanese through the opening of other battlefronts. Moreover, the fact that the Chinese never surrendered despite experiencing immense losses meant that Japan needed to continue expending resources throughout the country, which decentralized its forces. Roosevelt placed his hopes in China as a pillar of a new world order. In November 1943, Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek received an invitation to a conference in Cairo that included Roosevelt and Churchill. This alliance had significant symbolic significance because, for example, Roosevelt himself declared China as one of the four policemen of the world order, along with the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Even Chiang Kai-shek became a kind of exotic political celebrity for Americans, as propaganda posters featuring his image were displayed in American lands, and his wife even addressed the U.S. Congress. However, it was not all beneficial for China, as it was asked to withstand Japanese attacks without having access to the resources that the United States, Great Britain, or even the Soviet Union had. While some retired American aviators fought under the name of a unit called the Flying Tigers, Western ground troops did not fight in China. The Allies had to manage their resources, which were limited due to the state of the war, and they thought it more reasonable to prioritize Europe. This is why, outside of external aid, China's determined defense was crucial in defeating the Axis. By 1942, the Japanese Empire was fighting on two fronts. On the one hand, in China, where it was bogged down and consuming resources, and on the other, against the United States in the Pacific. As a result, between 1942 and 1943, the Japanese General Staff reduced offensive activities on Chinese territory because the central objective was to capture American bases in the region. By August 1945, and after several years of conflict, the situation looked increasingly apocalyptic for Japan. The Soviet Union dealt a brutal blow in Manchuria, where the Red Army devastated Japanese troops, which alarmed the Imperial High Command. To make matters worse, this was followed by Germany's surrender and the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. With their backs against the wall, the emperor decided to surrender, putting the entire nation on its knees before the Allies. In continental Asia, the last battles took place in Hunan and Guangxi provinces, but in the end, more than 1 million Japanese soldiers surrendered to the Chinese government. The war had ended. We could conclude that the Second World War shaped China, and China shaped the Second World War. After all, tensions in the Asian North initiated the entire conflict. Furthermore, without China, the Allies probably could not have defeated Japan. The war fundamentally changed the Chinese political landscape, leading to the downfall of the nationalist government and the rise of Mao Zedong's communism. Today, China has explicitly embraced significant portions of its wartime history that remained taboo for much of the Cold War. It has been explicitly stated that both communist and nationalist veterans will be honored whenever the fallen in the Second World War are remembered, reconciling the history of the ancient country. We're reaching the end of this presentation, and we'd like to ask you, do you believe that China could have had a better performance in the Second World War if it had received more direct support from the Allies? Share your opinions in the comments. That's it for today's video. We appreciate you for staying until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming episodes of Military History.